Hey, Jeannie.
Yeah, Bruce.
Who's on the show today?
Today we have Janelle London and Matthew Metz from Cultura.
Hi,
welcome.
Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
What are we talking about today?
Talking about gasoline.
So, Cole, what about gasoline?
Gasoline is a major fossil fuel that people need to focus on a bit more and use data-driven approaches to cut its use.
Are we talking about gasoline for cars, transportation gasoline?
That's the gasoline we're talking about. Yeah, it's an enormous source of carbon emissions. We are being given this warning by scientists that we need to cut emissions from vehicles basically in half by 2030, and we're not yet on track.
That's coming up pretty quickly. So how are we going to do that? I mean, we have an EV, but we're in the industry. We pay a lot of attention to this stuff, and the people we tried to buy EVs from really didn't seem to want to sell us one at the Honda or BMW, wherever we went.
The car dealers are weirdly unenthusiastic, at least around our Cambridge and Boston at selling EVs. At least a couple of years ago they were.
Well, luckily right now, overall demand for EVs is exceeding the supply of them. So that's great. But we've got incentives. So governments give incentives for people to get EVs. But they're not really focusing on the main goal of those incentives, which would be to maximize gasoline cuts. And so our approach is, instead of just selling an EV or incentivizing EVs for anybody, let's incentivize EVs for the people who are burning the most gasoline. If they can switch to an EV, that's displacing a lot of gasoline and helping all of us to breathe easier and helping us to have a healthier climate.
So you're suggesting that my EV that I use to commute 2 miles a day is wasting an EV that someone else should be using that they drive more?
Not at all. Every gallon of gasoline we can displace is valuable, and we appreciate folks like you for growing the market for EVs. And in terms of public policy, in terms of government incentives, we're thinking we should use those incentives where they matter the most to maximize gasoline cuts.
Yeah, that would make economic sense for the drivers of those EVs as well, right? Sounds efficient. How do we do that?
One of the ways that we do it is, instead of just incentivizing the purchase of EVs, we incentivize the displacement of gasoline, because that really is the point of an EV, is to displace gasoline. And so one way to do that is by paying for gasoline displacement. And so, for example, it's possible to calculate how much gasoline a person uses in a year. So a big user of gasoline in America, what we call a gasoline superuser, uses about 1,000 gallons a year and up to sometimes 2,000 or 3,000. And so if you say, for example, we'll give that person $10 for every gallon of gasoline that they displace, then they would get a $10,000 displacement award that they could use for an EV. Where someone, maybe such as yourself, that's using 200 gallons a year, you'd get $2,000. You'd get significantly less. And so it's a way of sort of bringing carbon pricing into EV incentives. And so you get that kind of efficiency directed to where you want, but you don't have the political downsides of
gas tax.
Gas tax.
So I'm curious how it would work, because I'm picturing someone that drives a pickup truck. I'm from Texas originally, and their pickup truck can't just go to another driver, right? If they're going to get the $10,000, that vehicle is still going to be guzzling gas, just under some other ownership. Is there?
Yeah, but the odds are is that it will kind of regress to the mean. So a pickup truck going from someone who's using 1,000 gallons a year is going to go to someone using the average of maybe 450. And so, that's a big step forward.
We had this idea of, let's get EVs into the hands of the biggest gasoline users to displace the most gasoline. And so we started looking around for information on who are these biggest gasoline users and where do we find them? And there was pretty much no information out there. There's just, no one is really tracking gasoline consumption and finding where these super users are. So we set about to do it. So we found an amazing amount of data where we could, at a very granular level, find where these super users are, what vehicles they're driving, and a bunch of other data about them so that we can identify them and so that governments can target them for switching to EVs first.
So what would that be, the Sunoco credit card? Where do you find that data?
Yeah, so we were very lucky to get some data from the California Department of Motor Vehicles, and also what's something called the Bureau of Automotive Research that does smog checks and records odometer readings when they do those smog checks. And so by using odometer readings and knowing the make, year, and model of the vehicle, which tells us its miles per gallon, we're able to figure out how many miles that vehicle travels on average per year and how many gallons of gasoline it's using. And so when we know the type of vehicle, and we also know the zip code level where this vehicle is located. So suddenly we are able to see, kind of visualize in a map, where are the heaviest concentrations of what we're calling these gasoline super users, and a bunch of other demographics about the zip codes where they live, what the main jobs are, where maybe they're near a major metropolitan area where it looks like they may be commuting a bunch of miles, the vehicles they drive, the languages that they speak, all sorts of data that's really helping us focus in on them.
Cool. Can you give us any examples of locations or neighborhoods or places where this seems to be working?
Sure. One example is a zip code in California in the city of Los Banos. And there, 26% of folks are gasoline super users. So that's pretty high concentration. The median income there is $63,000, which is kind of a little bit low for California. And that zip code is located 80 miles away from the major metropolitan area that includes San Jose. And so what we can tell from the data that we've been gathering is probably a lot of those super users are commuting round trip to San Jose every day. That would be 160 miles. And we can also figure out that is, 160 miles is doable. It's within the range of most EVs today. So they could probably switch pretty easily and cover their commute. And then we also find that most people in that zip code are in single family homes. They could more easily install an EV charger than, say, somebody in an apartment building. So they could switch to an EV, get all the way to San Jose, come back, charge overnight at home where the electricity rates are the cheapest. And so there's not any technical barriers to them switching. Now, you might say, oh, but hang on, they can't afford an EV, $63,000 a year. Of course, EVs aren't affordable. A lot of people think EVs are not affordable, but the thing about gasoline super users that's different from other drivers is that they already have an enormous monthly cash flow that they're spending buying all that gasoline. Their vehicles, we're also finding, tend to be older vehicles, obviously with a lot of miles on them because they're doing an average of 30,000 miles a year. And so carrying that monthly cash flow of the gasoline payments and maintenance, they could easily redirect that money towards making payments on a new electric vehicle. And so we've run a bunch of calculations, and we found that in most cases, super users actually save on a per monthly basis by switching to an EV.
Yeah, we found that people tend to overstate or overconsider the upfront cost compared to the operating cost in terms of all-in cost of vehicles, and for various reasons. But if a policy can kind of get over that hump, it can save everyone money.
Yeah, we're finding there's some companies, very creative businesses, that are starting to look at how to deal with that upfront cost. Companies that have things like an EV subscription model where you just get the EV and then pay on a per mile basis. And so those companies are very interested in what we're doing, and that we are able to locate where are those high mileage drivers who could really benefit from switching to an EV.
So that sounds like a prime place for some kind of a pilot program. I mean, there are always people, and I'm thinking people like funders that are interested in their, the highest impact for the dollar. And if you could kind of roll something out in that town, you could, make a really big difference pretty fast, I would think. So what's happening with the data? And what are next steps?
To really achieve the scale that we need to move really fast. And Janelle mentioned the savings on gasoline. Well, the people that benefit the most are these kind of lower, moderate income super users. And so what we need to do is put together a coalition of people very concerned about income equality, about racial equality, and people that are really concerned about the climate, and really push together. And that push hasn't always been as well coordinated as it should. And we think that with this data, and when people really see this, we can get that coalition to really expand further the EV incentives. I mean, now the federal government has done through the Inflation Reduction Act, that's great, $7,500 tax credit. But for a lot of people, that's still not going to make an EV accessible. And some people don't even benefit from tax credits towards the lower end of the spectrum. And so we really need to do a lot to bring those people along, and so because there's just so many benefits from doing so. By Going after the gasoline superusers, the biggest users, that will do the most to decrease overall demand for gasoline in the US, which also helps bring the price of gasoline down for others. So it really has broad benefits for society.
In California this year, with the help of Assemblymember Phil Ting, we actually introduced a bill that would prioritize for EV incentives lower income super users. So again, we're getting the climate benefits because they are super users, and they would be getting an enormous economic kind of relief from gasoline burden, right? The enormous financial burden that gasoline poses to their households. And that bill actually just in its first year passed through 2 committees with bipartisan support. A rare thing these days, but we saw that people on both sides of the political aisle saw that they have people in their district who are dying from paying all this money for gasoline, who could really benefit from a switch in EV incentives like this.
Do you see it being like by individual? When you say super users, is it this person or this house, this guy, or is it more by zip code, neighborhood, like the kind of informing policy design more broadly? Or would you actually target individual super gas users for EVs?
Yeah, I mean, the government actually knows who these people are because they do it just the same way that we can. So they could send a letter to people and say, hey, you can benefit from an EV. Maybe here's the additional incentives that you can get. So it can be actually a very, individualized targeting of people, of that opportunity.
Yeah, well, you're really bringing together a lot of issues that so many people care about these days. So I agree, it's got to be bigger than a pilot. And I also think that there ought to be a ton of people interested. I'm wondering what you're doing in terms of outreach and kind of getting all the stakeholders involved. And then are you working with community groups in some of the communities where you've already identified them, like this one location you're talking about, where there are maybe community groups that are already working with the people in that location on energy things?
So what we're doing is right now is we're getting those tools together, getting all the data together, and for California we're pretty much almost there. We hope to publish either late this year or first part of next year. And we're also providing a website so that people will be able to access this information for themselves, and so it'll really be public. And I think when a lot of equity communities, a lot of different people are going to say, hey, there's a vast outflow of cash from our community that we could really bring back in, to spend that money locally, to go to renewable energy. I think then it's going to start to mushroom, and we're going to do whatever we can to push that along.
So if people watching the show want to find that information, that data, the website, those maps, is there a place they can go now?
This is what they should do. Is they should, sign up on Cultura website, and we're gonna do a big release in a month or 2, and then they'll be the first to know. They'll get notified, and I mean, there's a lot of good information about this already. These concepts on Cultura's website, especially our first super users report, and there's a lot of analysis at the national level. But really, this last granular level, they'll have to wait a little bit.
Cool.
It's not surprising this is coming out of California and that the data is somewhat available where you are. What are your hopes for this expanding to other states?
Yes, we are gathering enormous numbers of data sets. We're finding data sets in areas that we had not thought of before, and they're giving us a clearer and clearer picture of super users and where they are, and enabling us to figure that out across the entire country. So yes, our plans are big. Our plans are to have very granular, the most detailed look ever at gasoline consumption across the U.S. And so we are working on that. The data sets are amazing, like street cameras, things that are helping us figure out exactly, a lot of very detailed information about these folks.
We need to understand how consumers use gasoline. There's a lot of data out there from the federal government. In California, they use 15 billion gallons and things like that. But we've never had a granular understanding of how actually gasoline is used in the street. And we really need that. And if we have that, we can really begin to attack the problem of gasoline with much more sophistication, from more angles, making better investments. That's a process that I think really needs to move forward.
And I would just add that another thing we're doing is issuing a big survey of gasoline super users to better understand their perceptions and attitudes about EVs, and to start to understand what's going on inside their minds. What would it take for them to be willing to switch to an EV.
How are you finding survey participants?
SurveyMonkey has what's called a panel, and super users are about 10% of the population. So we're doing a very broad sample and anticipating that 10% of those who respond are going to be super users.
But that survey is national US participants, you think?
And we're starting with a California survey. Since we do have this very detailed data, we can test it against the responses of people in these various zip codes and understand more kind of what they're thinking.
Everything that we've been talking about, we want to do nationally and ultimately globally. We think that this is a story that needs to be told everywhere.
And by the way, there's no one in the world we're aware of that is looking at gasoline consumption at this kind of granular level. And this is a major, this is one of the biggest sources of carbon emissions. So, if governments were companies, of course they'd be looking at all the data. And that's what needs to happen now.
This idea of really segregating the biggest users of a fossil fuel, it really it's actually we kind of invented it, and it actually needs to be applied to other domains, from home heating oil to many different areas to guide investment. And right now, generally, all users are sort of treated equally, regardless of how much fuel that they're using for different government programs. So we really need to get a little bit smarter on that and really go after the biggest fossil fuel users in many different domains.
A lot of people say, well, what about people who live in apartment buildings and they don't have easy access to EV charging? What will we do for them? And I would just say that there's 44 million apartment units in the US. And so instead of trying to get EV charging for all of them, if we focused on the ones where super users live, that would have a lot bigger payoff in terms of gasoline reduction.
Easy enough to put them in the parking lot.
I'm going to say that most of the analyses that I've seen of electrification of transportation, and that really is counting cars, right? So it's about market share of cars going off the lot. It's the share of cars on the road, how many EVs on the road, and the idea of tracking and designing policies that address usage and miles traveled, and therefore CO2 and other air pollution and effects of fossil fuel combustion. It's great idea. Let's figure out how to do that.
Yeah, right now there's just this assumption out there that all EVs displace gasoline equally. And we now know that that is very untrue. The top 10% of drivers in the US are burning a third of all the gasoline.
Whoa, people should know that.
In terms of traditional thinking about this, it's kind of a gas tax or a carbon tax, or a per mile insurance kind of tax. That would be the way to handle this, right? Because that would address the usage, right? But you're saying if you want to give incentives for EV adoption, how do we target those in a way that they're going to be most effective?
Right, and the gas tax is pretty unfair. What we're finding is the people who use the most gasoline aren't doing it because they love to drive around in big, inefficient cars. They're usually doing it either because they can't afford to live near where they work, so they're commuting a lot of miles every day, or they're driving as part of their work, often in an old, pretty inefficient vehicle. So it's not like they're trying to do this. They need relief from the spending that they're having to do on all this gasoline.
Yeah, they're generally kind of pushed to the fringes of the big metropolitan areas. And so, spending, as I say, 10, 15, sometimes 20% of their income on gasoline. And then you come along and say, oh, we're going to tax you another 10% of your income, your household budget. That's not very popular. And there's nothing they can really do about it, as Janelle says. So when you look at it that way, the efficiency of the gas tax sort of starts to have a little different color on it.
Right. And the relief that Janelle was talking about is really meaningful to those households who need it, but also really benefits society. So we should all be paying into that. It's a very good idea.
Yeah, one question I have is with some of the utility programs for efficient air conditioners or efficient refrigerators, where there were subsidies and incentives, we would have a requirement that you don't just get the new refrigerator and put the old inefficient one in your garage or in your basement. So there was a kind of let's take the problematic stuff that we're replacing out of the system and shoot it, or put it in a landfill or recycle it. So I guess one of the things I've been thinking about with cars is how do we, in addition to incentivizing the EVs, is there a way to kind of take the clunkers off the
The thing is that 2022 Ford F-150 V8 pickup only gets a couple miles better gallon than one from like 2005. Whereas a refrigerator, like a modern refrigerator, is probably like 2x or 3x more efficient. If you say, well, we're taking this F-150 off the road and then a brand new one is coming in the back door, it doesn't make any sense. And so like what we're kind of counting on is that to the extent a super user sells their F-150, that it's going to go to a more medium level user, like kind of like it's a regression to the mean. So that will reduce the overall consumption by that vehicle by maybe 2 to 3 times.
Presently, super users are on track to be the last people to switch to EVs, and we need to flip that. They really need to be the first people. The other thing is, if we can get these biggest users of gasoline to switch to EVs first, it would take a lot fewer total EVs on the road to cut vehicle emissions in half. So just in California, if we could get the biggest users to switch first, we would need 9 million EVs on the road to cut emissions in half. And if the super users, the biggest users, switched last, as they're currently on track to do, it would take 24 million EVs on the road to cut vehicle emissions in half.
Yeah, at the national level, if super users go first, it's 98 million. And if they go last, it's like 235 million. And that's assuming that there's like 260 million light-duty vehicles on the road, which depends on definition. But if super users are last, that would be almost double our annual vehicle production in the U.S. for 10 years. So, it would be, it'd be a lot.
Yeah, so especially when we're kind of supply constrained on new EVs, then the logic of this is even more compelling.
And a lot of people will say like, oh, everyone should just switch to bikes or public transit. But for super users, they're doing an average of 30,000 miles a year. So they are just not great candidates to move to public transit or bikes.
Yeah, especially when they live primarily out in the fringes where, everything's far apart. People have complex lives, going in myriad different directions, along with a long commute. It's extremely difficult. We're actually looking into ways that car ways to do it, but it's tough.
Well, hey, thanks for being on the show. It's great learning about this.
It's really nice meeting you.
Thanks, Bruce and Jeannie.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.